Welcome to the Practice Podcast, conversations probing the nature of practice. I'm your host, Dave Fearon.
This is really an opportunity for us to listen to a theoretical thinker, my son Dave, thinking, as he often does, very deeply about why things happen the way they do in a systemic way. Conversation, looking very, very closely at things that happen as people interact with each other. That's a practice of conversation. But perhaps the practice of thinking theoretically, of pondering, of willingly entertaining different ideas than the mainstream about any particular subject, because they bring in a different philosophy or a different science, then that's what Dave is doing in this conversation and helping his old dad learn something, again, something new. In this case, we started with a focus on Illya Prigogine, who was that kind of thinker. I guess the conventional would be, he didn't think inside the box. Prigogine probably would say, no, there is no box. And there's no such thing as status quo either. So, hey, listen in, see what you think. Now, here's the point. See that you do think. I'm saying that to myself because that's what my son Dave has asked me to do. Think. So, folks, one of the most enlightening aspects of this podcast series comes in the conversations that I have with Dave Jr., who is a sociologist, recovering sociologist, as am I. But it gives us a perspective on everything that we've talked about in the podcast, including practice and the context for practice and the way that practice is focused through conversation, all of that. So the other day we were saying, what else, Dave, other than George Herbert Mead, still sticks with you after all these years that got you thinking about what we call social inaction, or what you call social inaction. And you said one word. What was that word?
Prigogine.
Prigogine.
Which I may be pronouncing wrong, but...
Well, who knows? He's been dead a long while, so he's not going to get upset with you about that. But talk a little bit about that. Help me, Dave, folks, he's instructing me. I do remember something of him, Prigogine, when I was studying and among the philosophers, but I sure that wasn't as influenced as Dave has been. So let's talk about Prigogine.
Yeah, and this might be a little more of a lecture to the extent that I've pulled it together after not thinking of him for. I now remember where I first heard the name, and there was a book called The Aquarian Conspiracy that was very popular.
Oh yeah,
I would say it's the early 90s, maybe the very end of the 80s. I should have it here in front of me, then I would remember the name. A woman, I believe her last name was Ferguson.
That was a book
yes,
people
Marilyn
whispered about.
Yes, Marilyn Ferguson. I remember the last name. She brought together a lot of really interesting ideas. I would say it was one of my first introductions to systems theory in general. I would say and this would have come out around the time I was actually first published in 1980. So I was probably picked it up while I was still in college, which went up through the end of the 80s. And then I don't think I picked it up in high school, but I remember just vaguely an interest in such things from debating evolution and creationism with one of my friends in high school. Got me into a little extra deep into evolution theory. And a general interest in systems theory, I think so. And so as I was picking up in college, social psychology and neurophysiology and looking at George Herbert Mead and those areas of philosophy, that book was interesting. And so I picked up, I looked into Prigogine at that point, and also I think read some of his original works, but also wrote books about his works. A guy named Eric Jantz, Jantz, was one.
Yeah.
It's The Self-Organizing Universe, I believe, was his book, and I spent a lot of time with that.
Yeah,
and so I think that was a foundational idea that then kind of I lost track of, but as I was doing the continuing with Mead and George Herbert Mead and social psychology, and then getting into conversation dynamics and sociolinguistics, and then applying it to social organization. And so by the time I was developing the dissertation work that I was calling Social Enaction, it was there, but I think the ideas have faded a bit. As I recalled it, I picked it up again, got his book out of the library, watched a couple of neat YouTubes of his lectures in later years.
Yeah.
So kind of got back up to speed. So why is he interesting? Well, who is he first? He was born in 1917 in Moscow, just months before the revolution. So his family fled to Germany, and then to Belgium. He was mostly raised in Belgium. His father was a chemist, and he became a chemist too, but got into teaching, I believe, early on, and taught in the U.S. for a while in the 60s. And then I think finished out his career in Europe, but he's best known for receiving the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977, and the work that earned them that prize was his work on what he called dissipative structures, and as a new empirical approach to thermodynamic systems and what happens to systems that are far from equilibrium state. Applied initially to chemistry, but also works, as we'll talk about, very well for biological systems, neural systems, potentially social systems.
What was his first name, by the way?
Illya, so Illya, and then the last name is Prigogine, Prigogine.
Yeah.
So it might be Prigogine in Russian, but I think the French usually call him Prigogine.
Yeah.
So, I didn't look too much into his influence, but I think he's had a strong influence in system dynamics overall, both computational, probably more in material sciences, but I think it's gone on to be, a large field in much more complex, especially computational systems dynamics that one can be found today. But I don't know that there's been a deep application of its implications for social interaction in the social world. His later works looked at culture and organizations to some extent and applied the ideas, but I think it fits very well with what we've been talking about with social enaction. And I think it fits into where the social enaction approach does more widely, as to maybe giving a more of a theory to organization, where the classical business organization theory or organizational behavior, I think has been kind of a hodgepodge of theories borrowed from sociology and elsewhere, but really I wouldn't say it settles. I don't know. Maybe there's been some changes in the last 30 years, but
not that I'm aware of.
I don't think it's really settled on the notion of what is the core of human group organization.
Right.
I don't think what we'll talk about today actually answers that, but it does. It addresses a few very crucial things such as what is a system? How does it apply to organizations of any sort, but particularly for human groups and group life? How does a system change over time? Can that change be predicted? Can it be adequately modeled by knowing the relationship of the system's parts and how it changes over time? Is it actually something that could be predicted or even understood fully, even very simple systems? So if organization theory uses the metaphor of systems, which I believe it often does,
Yes.
Is it possible that their basic theory of systems is maybe completely wrong, or just doesn't have a basis in what's even applicable to the physical world? Because it's using, even as a metaphor, it might be using some ideas that simply don't apply to living systems or brains or how people interact with each other. And I think as we go through Prigogine, you'll see some basic findings when you look at even super simple systems, such as the flow of chemicals in a fluid.
Yeah, which is where his started. Yeah.
Yeah, you start to see an empirical basis that maybe we can pull all the way up to the worlds we live in. So, and it gives some interesting ways of coming at some of the other aspects of social enaction that we've been talking about. So it's just a quick refresher of what we are talking about with social enaction as a way of expressing the practice of organizing socially, of talk and interactions, looking at those ongoing moments of people as they're actually engaged in talk and social interaction in any moment, and arguing that this is an empirical basis for social organization. It's empirical in a literal sense of being observable.
Right.
It can be observed, people engaged in social interactions. And more than that, the participants in themselves are literal observers of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And how does that matter as part of the course of their achieving social organization in any moment? So this is what we've been calling the practice of social organization. And it has these features of an action being defined as the performance of talk and interaction, which the participants bring forth and sustain kind of a mutual reference and a mutual understanding. That's social in effect, because it's aspects of it are literally made to be shared amongst the participants. People coordinate their actions on the basis of these mutual understandings of meanings and contexts. And yet there is no third thing. There's no emerging meaning that has its own kind of form or realities. For example, the simple notion that a symbol or a word will have a causal effect on people's behavior, that's a completely wrong notion. What we're talking about is more this ongoing achievement of people kind of stuck in their own heads with their brains churning along, and yet achieving a type of coordination that gives us the sense of being real people with selves interacting with real others, and thinking that we mutually understand each other.
Yeah.
When really we're just kind of casting things out there and hoping it goes along. And some of the other dynamics of that we talked about in past podcasts are this being sustained by language that people share, social context that people share, but also their ability to warrant what they're talking about in the immediate built-up history and context of the moment, and hold each other accountable to keeping up that invoked context in various ways. And that's boiling down quite a lot into.
No, it's a great boil down, and I'll just share an image there of holding accountable. We talk a lot in larger conversations about practice, about leadership, and there are all kinds of probably more theories of leadership than you could stuff in the Johns Hopkins library. And yet what I'm hearing now is that leadership itself could be holding each other accountable in the moment.
Right.
So you have behavior between two or more people that seems to be done in concert, and they seem to be moving ahead in time. And yet I know you got a lot more to say, but I'm just getting this image of while we're looking for the tall man, waving forward for leadership.
Right.
It could be happening right under our noses in a way that people are socially enacting this accountability.
Yeah, but what people kind of think of, if you were to think about that in a simple way, you think of the leader giving a command, and that's a cause and effect upon some group of soldiers or something moving forward.
Mm-hmm.
Or that an organization it turns along because of decisions having that cause and effect. But what we're talking about instead is something that could take something that is abstract, like a cultural tradition or an institution like medical practice, and take it down to what's really tangible. What is it that's bringing forth those moments of stability that let you recognize something like a social institution or a context?
Yeah.
So all those moments, those people building up the situations that they're engaged in a moment.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that work? How is that a real system dynamic? And what doesn't work are simple notions of organization. One of the main ones is the notion of thermodynamic equilibrium,
mm-hmm.
which we can see really in some of the earliest social theories. For example, Talcott Parsons had back in the 30s, 40s, had this notion of structural functionalism, so that stable societal functions, stability in society was based on the knowledge of functions and the ability to if there were a challenge to that function, pull back to a sort of an equilibrium that keeps, in which everyone knows the social norms and sticks to them. But behind that is an assumption that's somewhat of a Newtonian notion, like the swinging of a pendulum.
Yeah.
Will, once its energy is lost, come down to a stopping point. That stopping point being the equilibrium point. So as we start building beyond that and looking at what Prigogine was studying, you get a very different way of thinking about systems that show that you really can't think of a notion of equilibrium as applying to what people do or what their brains do at all. It just doesn't work. So let's wade in.
All right. You got me curious now. If equilibrium is not going to be the idea of the day, then what is Prigogine helping us see as a better way of understanding it?
Yeah. And so the model of it's a model of self-organizing system dynamics. And the nice, we've heard that term self-organizing before, but there's something real tangible here in his theory that we could actually start thinking of, even in the physics of living things. What is it that keeps them going? What is necessary, for example, for a cell in the body to stay alive?
Mm-hmm.
Just thinking of a single cell, you could think of it as being a relationship of components, nucleus and mitochondria and membrane, but all of which is in a dynamic relationship. It's never static, because a static cell is a dead cell. Mm-hmm. So it takes an input of energy in order to survive, and also an ability to export waste, mm-hmm. which we could think of as entropy, the accumulation of which would be a disruption.
Mm-hmm.
And the cell as a living system has an ability to adjust to external disruptions, which we could call perturbations. sufficient perturbation could affect its integrity. Parts, its membrane rips apart, bad things get in, and it dies. So, large enough perturbations could destroy it, but short of that, it's able to adjust and handle those perturbations, keep its overall integrity of the structure dynamically. And the other interesting things is that cells can work with other cells to get more emergent wholes that themselves can have organizations that also maintain a stability in themselves. So you have something that becomes kind of coherent characteristic in its function, like a liver. And the liver does certain things, and it's necessary for keeping the whole body alive.
Yeah.
So it's easy to kind of see some of those, how things fit together in that way. But some of the principles that Prigogine looked at, and what earned him his Nobel Prize, was looking at things initially much simpler than cells, just looking at chemical systems and how, under different conditions, patterns that emerge in chemical systems have some common characteristics. One of which is that if a simple chemical system is taken far from equilibrium, meaning that there's enough input of energy to keep it from really settling down into the basics, which would be just molecules bumping into each other. If you took a simple system like a fluid between two metal plates, and then heat one of the plates, it initially starts a current, and so you get an emerging pattern, which is more than just the molecules bumping together, but you get a correlation of large groups of those molecules forming a flow. And that flow can take on a pattern as it moves from the hot plate and cools at the slow plate, goes back up to the top. You'll see an emerging pattern that has some interesting features, because you'll see that it remains stable, but it's doing it. Even a fairly simple system could do that, can retain its stability by adjusting to perturbations while keeping an overall form. And it, with a simple system, it does so in a simple a simple way of kind of statistically being more likely to have this correlation than not under certain, given its immediate environment. But as you build up into even more complex systems, and then eventually ones that are simple life forms, then you have these more systematic ways of like getting rid of the waste and adjusting in more complex ways to the perturbations of its environment. And so what are interesting then are when this is achieved, these systems that are able to do that, he called dissipative systems. They're dissipative in the sense of getting rid of entropy while maintaining form in their dynamic relationships among their components, all at this far from equilibrium state. So it's in an open environment in which there's sufficient energy coming in, and it's kind of this existential sense of either adjusting to the perturbations in the environment or falling apart.
Right on the very edge of that. Yeah, just right. That's, I get it.
Yeah. So you have a sense of stability that is dynamic. It's not stability of a resting point like a pendulum. You never get back to those points where there are all the molecules involved come back to just this kind of stable relationship. But all those molecules are still there doing their thing. There's still that cause and effect bumping together. It's just a coherency that then has its own properties because you have these larger coherent patterns. And so kind of getting a little deeper, we'll often think of stability as an evidence of some sort of a persistent form, and then the form could be described in abstract terms.
Right.
So there's the cell structure has this abstract wholeness to it, but really you can think of this the stability being more of a description of averaging over time. There's no real reference point in any sense. It's just this continual achievement of stability. So there's no sense of having a predetermined form or whole towards which the system will move. So often poorly done notions of evolution will think, well, a system is evolving towards its ideal state. But it's really, we're talking more about just a continual achievement of the stability. But it is something that could be called self-organizing.
Right.
So I'm just going to keep blasting on with my lecture, but
no, this is really good. And
yeah,
but it's not moving. Nothing's moving, therefore, to an ideal state. It's just maintaining a state, if you will. So when you're adapting, you're going to sort of flow into a different state, but you're still essentially the same, whatever is flowing, whether it's a chemical or cell structure, or maybe even people. But
yeah, because it's really hard to think of this sense of constant movement and constant really instability when we're thinking of things that seem very solid in the world, like the meanings of our words or the definition of a situation. It really isn't. So it's that flow state, which one could get in with maybe advanced meditation or something like that.
Well, there's a lot there, though. There's a lot of people.
Yeah.
The person I had the conversation with last week has shifted his whole sort of outlook toward mindfulness in terms of organization development, and studied a number of different Eastern thought.
And we
probably would be resonating with you right now.
Yeah, well, I won't take the talk in that direction yet because there's some interesting implications. But let's look
back to Prigogine.
Yeah, let's look a little more closely about what self-organizing means in this sense, because what is the self? So if you look at a system, we can maybe think about a cell, which is a little more complex, but you can still think of this successful organizing being this adjustment to perturbations in which the dynamic relationships of the components can still continue. And so in doing so, there's this distinction, this active distinction that this adjustment's bringing forth between that which sustains a system and then the environment from which the perturbation arises. And in a way, it creates an environment in a meaningful sense, because you have this self, not self distinction being sustained in the sense that if it's successful, the organization remains intact. If not, the organization is destroyed. So and it's self-referencing in a sense that it's the internal relationships amongst the components that, by successfully adjusting, sustain something that could be called a self. And it's certainly not a self in a conscience sense, but in a way, it's doing something very crucial that is common to what consciousness might be in this very primitive sense, that you have to have this ongoing self-referencing and sustaining of a system, or the parts of a system, or lots of systems interacting with each other. And so in this sense, Prigogine called the dissipative system self-organizing. And this is a very important part of the chemical world, but really the living world, living systems in particular. Some of the interesting features, perhaps one of the most, was the way that dissipative systems change in relation to their environment, and change in a way that could be called evolving in some contexts, but in other ways, just kind of this ongoing sense of adjustment. If in a lot of systems, even simple chemical ones, you'll see, you'll see the system adjust to perturbations in levels of energy and its ability to export entropy up to some degree. But sometimes when it's getting close to that point at which it might be destroyed, if it doesn't successfully adjust, it can adjust in ways. It can adjust in more than one way. Basically, there might be essentially a few different states in which the system might achieve a successful adjustment to a perturbation.
Mm-hmm.
For example, a simple amoeba in relation to some chemical threat could go one way or another way. It has to get away from that thing, but it could go left or it could go right or up or down if it's in a fluid. So an interesting thing about the dissipative system is that there's two things. One is the choice. There's effectively a choice being made, and that choice is something that's a very sudden reconfiguration of at least some of the parts into some different course. But where there are two or more courses, in a very real sense, the choice is fundamentally unpredictable. Prigogine made a lot of this, and I think it's true, and we don't have to get too deeply into it, but it gives a very interesting solution to even quantum mechanics.
Wow.
If the listeners ever listen to your PBS level versions of quantum mechanics, they'll talk about the observer and the effect of the observer and the various experiments where you take shoot particle light through a slit, and it will behave as either a particle or a wave. And the argument that the observer is the one that somehow is determining whether it's a particle or a wave. This is a much more fundamental sense, which actually physicists will say as well, that observation is really this sense of something is interacting with that which is with that being interacted with, so that it that the probability of possible, basically before that interaction, there's a level of probability of what could happen that then is collapsed into what did happen. And so for an amoeba going left or right, there's a probability, and then it's only in an abstracted sense of what could be done, because it's capable of states being reorganized in a way that will allow it to go left or right and still live. And yet there's nothing within that organization itself that you could say predicts which way it will go. And that's very fundamental, even at the level of, there's still molecules bumping together. There's no way of really thinking of that as predicting one direction or another. He talked about this in relation to physics as basically giving an arrow to time. And I invite people to kind of look for his YouTube video. Some of his old lectures he gave to one of the Nobel committees, and like a Nobel conference, and it gets pretty deep, but it's very interesting. But it's slightly tangential, but it to what we're talking about today. But just having that sense of, I think one of the key points is having this sense of fundamental inability to predict any of the course of relationships in either individual systems that have this self-organization or interactions among self-organizing systems. So
as I wonder if you're moving in that direction. You're saying that there's a lot of unpredictability in eventually when you get to the hierarchy of social, that maybe this is perpetuated.
It's why when you do look at systems dynamics as it's applied, it's largely there's quite a lot of probability theory that comes into it, and probability calculations, because that's really all you have. So you're modeling things and doing so in complicated ways. He was one of the early people doing lots of nonlinear calculations, and kind of the field built up around that since the 70s into how to actually model complex systems in this way. And it becomes very difficult very fast, which is why you need the best supercomputers have to be applied to it. And even if you had something like a model of three bodies orbiting each other, even that becomes super complicated to compute, and you run out of computer capacity pretty quick, at least for what your iPhone might handle. But
wow.
So the thought that you can when you have some things as complex as brains, and two people using their brains to interact, and with all their memories and history and all that, you can see how you can't really model it and have a computer solve it. But what you do have are people trying to solve that problem for each other and for themselves in that moment. They're living in that world of things that seem like they should be stable and should have predictable outcomes, and largely do for the most part, because as you and I are talking, I know you won't break into French and start speaking French. And
no, not speaking.
Yeah, and so I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to give my energy to that. Or I don't have to give my energy to much at all about how the words are put together into sentences, because all of that's predictable. And yet, at a fundamental level, maybe it isn't so predictable.
I get it.
So we're living in a world of probability, and I think this theory talks a lot about that. That another word for that bifurcation is he calls symmetry breaking. Symmetry is the notion of kind of that equilibrium stability, where things that are perturbable come back to a simple state, but you never get to that simple state in anything involving interaction of living things. Let's see what else is interesting about it. He talks a little bit about how communication might work in a sense, even among simpler, cells within a body. You can start thinking of living systems as being this relationship of, one being an observer in a sense to the other, because you can have one cellular group treating another by its properties as a whole rather than as its individual parts. And by having dynamic relationships built up of these interacting senses of what's whole, you can then get in itself another layer and level of self-organization, such as the liver, and that becomes stable over time. And then you have lots of other things like, how did DNA make it so that every time someone's born, they end up with a liver if everything goes well. So there's like layers and layers and layers of complexity, but also stability.
Oh my God.
Which comes down to the moments of our sitting here having a conversation.
Did they have a caution on Prigogine's book saying, caution, insanity likely?
Yeah, possibly.
As you read this, because it uproots or distorts. I don't know what the right words would be. And it's all good to know, because we talk a lot about change in this field, and I'm not sure I've heard really much definition of change itself, other than, from one state of affairs to another, or one form to another.
Yeah, because we have to
much deeper.
Yeah, because we have to never we have to be constantly remind ourselves that change is, for human groups, can never be cause and effect. Cause and effect simple cause and effect, simple stimulus response behavior simply isn't an applicable description of anything to do with people or their brains or their cells. You have to come up with something else,
Right.
which is more like describing evolution over time. Or we could think about all the systems that are working like this that we have to deal with constantly, and are sort of there in the background of any social organization. So you got biological systems, you have the brain very much working like this. Especially, even the way neurons fire. You could see this as an evolved capacity that started with very simple organisms that had the first nervous systems, but in the brain. I saw a video the other day of a new technique of watching brain cells kind of fire. It can only be done in mice because it uses a damaging dye, but it's so in that they were able to capture it in slow motions, and how just in half a second you can see all these patterns that just light up, and you really get this sense of these sudden reorganizations. So you can really think of the brain as optimized to bring itself to these bifurcation points very rapidly. So in half a second, you can have sudden reorganizations of many parts of the brain all at once. So you get, prefrontal cortex and observation, or the for motor, basically the ongoing relationships of sensory and motor that are constant and very complex, and using big parts of the brain all correlated and happening at once. And then so you have these very fast functions, but then you also have these slower constraining things, which are the neurochemicals like dopamine and which become kind of a regulating constraint that itself can kind of define aspects that really manifest themselves in the real world. So dopamine is fun when you're trying to go on a diet and you've given up sugar. And what happens when you haven't gotten over the craving of sugar is that the dopamine is stimulating what counts as pleasure at that moment. And that pleasure actually makes the prefrontal cortex start to slow down and not light up. And next thing you know, your motor activity has been almost, in a sense, almost taken over by simpler systems that only require grabbing a cupcake and shoving it into your mouth. and all our evolved Homo sapien minds are reduced to something much simpler. But
we're just gobblers. We become gobblers.
Yeah.
I'm curious. I know we're going to continue this conversation beyond the recording, and because there's so much for me to learn here, Dave. But I wonder. I keep having this sense of where is consciousness in this discussion, particularly as we move to the living side of things and up to out to we humans. One thing that I'm pretty sure of that the sociology, social psychologies, and other ologies have given us this idea of conscience, a consciousness, then maybe gives us the notion that we're controlling things.
Yeah.
A la, here we have organizations, cultures, rules, and all the rest. But what I'm hearing you talking about and interpreting Prigogine is, it may not be consciousness the way we think it is. So what's your thought on that?
Well, I think what we could think of our brains initially as a very complex community in itself, in which a lot of what is even as we look into a room and look at it and see, where's the cupcake, in the real sense, there's this self-preservation dynamic going on in which all the animals evolved to want the sweetest, richest food source in the environment. And the food industry has made an art form of providing us the very most desirable foods, make readily abundant. So, and I've seen some models that show that that's literally part of raw perception. But itself, all of it being but the old notion that all of these complex systems have this internal self-reference. Then you have self after self after self, and in the real sense, you have consciousness amongst the liver, consciousness in the heart, in consciousness in the gut bacteria of a sort, because all of it is this emergent perception of a certain sort as things successfully adjust to perturbations to the organizational closure of its parts. So and then you could go deeper and say that there are conscious experience as we talk to ourselves. We're getting back into that social enaction sense. We talk to ourselves, but what is talking? Who is talking? In an earlier podcast, we talked about George Herbert Mead, the I and the me.
That's right.
The me being the emergent symbolic talked about thing, but the I doing the talking. That I is itself in a kind of an emergent community of lots of things, some of which involve the ability to put things into words, but it's that sense of this recursive emergent self that finally we may have an argument for a materialist sense of self, in which because when this happens, one has the experience of self, and it's sufficient to describe it in this way. I don't necessarily believe that's fully the case, but at least it takes us pretty far into a materialist notion of self. There's a hot debates about idealism still. It's been for 300 years. There's still hot debates about whether idealism or materialism adequately describes consciousness. I'm not taking a strong stand on it either, because I got some way out notions in which one can argue in different ways, but we'll save that for another.
No, but I would think for many reasons, this particular conversation is additive to what we build up, not only you and I, but the whole sort of seeking behavior that I've been doing for months and months and months. It's sort of like self-organizing in the way it feels inside to me. Always looking for one more dollop of explanation or evidence or something that will feed the sweetness of ideas, if you will. And so when I'm entering into conversation, at some level, I'm not thinking and saying, I'm being in a way with that other person, so that for a few moments of time, we're maybe both of our deeper beings are just trying to stay going, keep going.
Keep going.
Yeah, exactly. That's our common cause is to keep going.
But it should give us
to not dissipate.
Yes, and it should give us a sense of humility, especially the notion that we can't really control and we can't even predict well. So, and again, to leadership. To understand what's real about social, and going back to, is there really, why hasn't this notion of social organization penetrated since it's certainly understood in the biological world, it's certainly understood, it's increasingly understood in the brain.
Yeah.
Why not at the social world? What's happened? Why,
I think you used the word hubris, and I think that's a clue.
Mm-hmm.
I think that we would be an enormous denial to think that there's only a small part of our whole that we are consciously controlling at any moment. And the rest of us is just, doing something differently than being controlled. And we don't want to know, we don't know what to call it, and we don't want to claim it because we can't take credit for it in a way. That's how things work. We have these ideas that we reject it.
Yeah.
And we take people like that philosopher, chemist, and we say, okay, here's your prize, but go away. And then he becomes obscure.
Yeah, because he's explaining why leaders are mostly just covering their ass and keeping their own crimes hidden or whatever. Or like you can look at the stock market, which isn't predictable. And so the best players in the stock market have figured out how to cheat and control the system because it's not predictable.
Well,
so
there's a lot more to learn, but I thank you again, always, because we are looking at practice as behavior, and behavior is exquisitely obscure in the sense of what you just said. What we see is not, well, we can see people behaving, acts, as we'd call them. There's so much more that goes on in, around, above, and through that is dynamic and is constantly being bumped up or hitting perturbations, and could instantly send that in a whole other direction, and we wouldn't even notice.
Yeah. So I maybe if I took 2 minutes, maybe I will sum up what we talked about, bringing it back to our, because we're adding something to our theory of social inaction, which is only on these podcasts because I never sit down and write it up on our website. But
it's
apart from that,
it's on record.
So social inaction, thinking of social inaction as a dissipative system, dissipative self-organizing system, we're given. We already have as a given, this is something far from equilibrium. There's no thermodynamic equilibrium involved because people are using their brains. They're not in a coma. So and then you have this performance, the sense of performance in the moment, in action as performance. There's an immediate environment. We're focusing on that. We're focusing on what's being brought forth, this mutuality of systematic behavior amongst two or more self-organizing entities. And so we could think of talk and the practices themselves as being sustained as though they're a living thing, as though the language brought forth has this sense of being either held together or falling apart.
Yeah, I get it.
And the people systematically have the ability to adjust to each other's mutual understanding.
Wow.
So you could think of change of a course of a conversation, for example, as evolving, but always as this, whatever the current conditions are, moving forward or falling apart moment by moment. That's why we focus on talk, looking at recordings to understand practice as it happens.
Yeah.
And we can think of the nature of change as maybe moving through these bifurcation points, these sudden reorganizations. And this might be very interesting to look at talk in this way.
Yeah.
How do people come up with new ideas together? And also thinking of how social action is fundamentally unpredictable in this sense. And then we could also, that third part of an action, warranting behavior, what that comes before holding each other accountable. So there's in this existential sense of what sustained and evolves, looking at how people deal with perturbation and adjustment, hold each other accountable, or even accountable by referencing their relationship to wider systems which they're a part. So context, social history, immediate history, everything that had occurred becomes a past, has to be re-invoked, resurrected in this sense, making it real for the moment of social inaction. And then, so, this gives us a little more tools for understanding how accountability works.
Wow.
So when I retire, I'll write another dissertation.
No, I'm glad, but you've got proof right here that this way of thinking that you have has not gone away. It hasn't faded over the years. It's still important to you, similar to what I said about my notion of feeling always seeking.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes we lock that onto a question or something that we can, like a chasing around the corner kind of thing. And in your case, I've known you a long while, and I've known you all your life, and you have a lot of things you do, but you always seeking the deeper understanding of systems. And as we go forward, I think it's going to make this a really classy podcast.
We'll see. Yeah.
But thank you, Dave. It's been another good one.
Yeah. We'll think of something else for next time soon.
Prigogine. No, that's
Illya Prigogine.
Illya Prigogine. Okay, I'm going to look for those videos. They're on YouTube.
Yeah, put his name into YouTube and
all right,
heavy stuff, but there's some good ones out there.
Check it out, folks. Thank you, Dave. If you'd like to hear more, listen in on Spotify, Automatic, and Apple Podcasts, or go to enactionresearch.com/podcast-page. And if you'd like to learn more about social inaction and the nature of practice, head over to enactionresearch.com for more information. Thank you for supporting this show. We look forward to hearing from you soon.